Now, as I mentioned, I want to thank everyone for inviting me here today. And for those who aren't familiar with me, I'm president of MV Consulting Incorporated, which is a media company. And I'm also a former Marine. I was raised in the Bronx, and I've lived overseas as well as worked overseas. Now, for those of you who do know me, you probably know me best for having covered the local, state, and national politics. This would include the 2008 presidential election, the 2010 midterm elections here in New York, as well as currently my work on the 2012 presidential election. And this is all via the political website that I just mentioned to you, which is called Vass Political Commentary. But recently, when I was asked to speak here, I have been writing about, as Dennis mentioned, Morgan Freeman and his comments on the Tea Party, his attack on the Tea Party. The words of Morgan Freeman echoed those same comments from Representative Maxine Waters and Representative Shirley Jackson Lee and the entire Congressional Black Caucus. In fact, they almost quote the stream of statements that have been coming out of certain portions of the media. That is what I would like to speak about today, the impact of the Tea Party on the media and what that means to America in general. Now, this may sound a little odd, of course, coming from a member of the press, but when you consider where the stance is on the media and the Tea Party, I think it's quite appropriate. For the last 2.5 years, the majority of the news outlets, like the New York Times and MSNBC, on cable television, they've all derided the Tea Party. There have been article after article attacking every aspect of the Tea Party and its members. And the Tea Party, throughout all this, you've been called racist or ignorant, fascist, and most recently even terrorists. The big question is, why? If we look over history in America, every time there has been a watershed moment in the country, there has been dissent prior to it. When America has changed, there has always been opposition that has led the way. The greater that opposition, though, generally the more massive that change that occurred, the more beneficial that change ultimately wound up being. When we think of the news media outlook on the 14th Amendment and the ending of slavery, there was a resistance to suffrage, the vociferous change to challenge, to civil rights, the ERA movement, Reaganomics, and now you in the Tea Party. Each was a sea change for the nation. Each was blasted as the end of America. Today, we have the liberals and the far-left pundits heaping visions of despair onto the backs of the Tea Party. We have celebrities parroting these calls and essentially calling for restrictions of the rights of freedom and the freedom of speech, a right they claim to be champions of. We have blogs and bloggers that assert unfounded personal beliefs as if they were fact, and elected officials that have equated support of the Tea Party and the values therein akin to the darkest travesties of mankind. This will surprise you, but I find that all to be a positive. These are all positives. And I say it's a positive because it demonstrates the fear that is amongst the political elite of the nation. Democrats and Republicans alike are terrified, not from the fear of force or the threat of violence, but from the fear of losing votes. For decades, if not longer, politicians have forgone the obligations to the public. They have advocated political party values over the will of their constituents. They have made choices based on preserving political power and dictated to the people the choices before them, and that perch is now being threatened. The Tea Party, by simple act of speaking out, has caused a ripple in America. Millions are among the Tea Party, and tens of millions that are not in the Tea Party yet, yet agree with your principles. And they are engaging their right to be heard. Politicians are in an uncomfortable and unfamiliar, for them, position to have to be accountable for their votes and their actions. Think of the status of Social Security. For decades, it has been approaching complete insolvency, a condition that received lip service and no action from either political party. Their fear of losing their political power base left them impotent to the needs of the people that had actually elected them. They rejected wholesale any action until the Tea Party, once you have appeared, suddenly that changed. Now there is serious discussion and at least the start of action. The potential for tens of millions of Americans to come has improved because a small group of Americans demanded action, and for that, you were demonized. Look at the healthcare reform, a convoluted mix of regulations, mandates, and taxes that took over 2,000 pages to hold its specifications. A law that has new revelations being uncovered every month since its passage. A passage that was so partisan, so politically inept, that it required virtual bribes within the Democratic Party while they held a supermajority in Congress. Were it not for the voice of the Tea Party, what other items might be in that law? What might have been allowed if not for the voice of the Tea Party? If you did not insist that politicians read that law or else. And they learned what else during the midterm elections, for those who did not. How likely would it be today that 26 states are now challenging the constitutionality of that law and be fighting against it if it were not for the Tea Party gathering a groundswell of support to repeal the law that the majority of Americans never wanted in the first place? Also consider that the news media, which is supposed to be the watchdog of government, likely would never have investigated the multitude of discrepancies and intrusions on American people that the healthcare reform imposes. Even as they denounce the Tea Party, they are required to announce how the healthcare reform is enabling the government to gather the health records of every American, which the Department of Health and Human Services is actively and currently preparing to do, as I have reported. Does anyone think that we would be here about these kinds of consequences if the Tea Party was not a consistent voice to challenge this law? Or even the national deficit, a matter of concern to tens of millions of Americans for decades. An issue that was routinely ignored or used as a political chopping block during the various election campaigns. An issue that was so far from the minds of politicians that they could not even fathom discussing the matter, as in the case of our own Representative Maurice Hinchey during the town hall meetings in the 2000 midterm elections, which we have displayed and reported. A situation that has progressed to the point of endangering the quality of life of every American and those yet to be born. All due to the inaction of politicians who are more than ready to just keep passing the buck on to another generation and another generation, as long as they kept their political power. But until the Tea Party caused the nation to look at the numbers and demand that government act as responsibly as voters do every month. That process has just begun. And the Tea Party, instead of being thanked for pointing out that there was a hole that was sinking the ship of this nation, you were lambasted. The media has tried to kill, in effect, the messenger. Yet the Tea Party remained a vital voice and a catalyst for getting Americans involved in politics again. Whether for or against the views of the Tea Party, Americans are becoming more and more active in who is being elected and how these politicians vote on legislation that affects all of their constituents. Such a reversal of power frightens these career politicians that have become lazy and sloth-like as they retain their seats of power because they dole out favors and befriend advantageous groups. That's why the former watchdog of politics, the media, has now turned on those it protected, and the media is lashing out against those that it should defend. But before I go further, I want to address something that may be a question for some. The question is, if this is really a sea change in America. Defenders of President Obama would claim that his election was the sea change, in fact, that this is only a defense against that change that I'm speaking about. The argument sounds very persuasive on its face, but let's look at the reality. The reality is that President Obama was not the forefront of a movement for change in America. If we recall, Senator John McCain was leading in polls for much of 2008 until the economic crisis that's still ongoing in this nation took hold. President Obama was close, but was not the resounding voice or choice for this nation. It was that crisis that made the difference, or more to the point, the manner in which the media used and was used to mold an emotional response to the crisis. Republicans were to blame for the downfall of the stock market, the loss of millions of homes, and the root of the meltdown of the economy. In part because President Bush was at the seat of power, and blame always lies with whomever is in that seat. But that is not the complete truth. The root of the mortgage crisis goes back decades to the Clinton administration, an easing of policy, allowing unqualified homeowners the ability to gain access to homes. And in that new market, those that would exploit opportunity took the opportunity. With the government taking its usual short-sighted stance, having made a political decision without understanding of real-world ramifications, these opportunists laid the groundwork for the eventual collapse, that is, the mortgage crisis. But President Obama rode the wave of anger about the change of economics in this nation. He offered hope as dark skies covered the nation. Like Pandora, the panacea of change did not define anything material. It was just different. At least with his excellent oration skills, it sounded different.